I'd like to give you a better cup. I mean, I'd like to give you a proper cup. It'll be a bit harder to hold, a cup and saucer, but you'll manage. Do you want that? Which one do you want?
Where is this? Where is this?
Oh, I don't know. A friend gave me this.
Oh, alright. It's a very pretty cup. Oh, I hope I don't spill it.
I was brought up on Baramba Station, which is about 10, 11 miles at the time from a little town called Gameri in the South Burnett district. My grandparents were actually brought to the Aboriginal mission of Cherbourg, as it was then called. They met there as a young couple and married, but after a few years, my grandfather, they both wanted to get away from being under, the protective situation which applied to many Indigenous people. So they were considered to be capable of managing outside and away from government protection. So grandfather got a job as on this cattle property, Baramba Station, and that would have been before I was born. Well, I spent my first couple of years of primary school there. We had to ride to the Baramba school. We had our horses. So I had my little pony Archie, and that's how I got to school.
You rode your horse to school?
Oh yes, yes.
Really?
Well, that was very common in those days, yes. It's the only way you could get there.
There you go.
Yeah.
And what was your pony's name again?
Archie.
Archie?
Archie, yes. He was pretty difficult to get out of the yard, actually.
How did you have to get him out?
Oh, you give him a bit of a kick and a little whip, and once I got him out of the gate, he was fine.
So these are your photos?
Yes, there's just a few here. They're very old. All we had those days was what they call little brownie box camera. So these are from there. These are my grandparents. Now, grandfather always wore shoes and socks, but for some reason here he is barefooted. and this is... So when I was about 7, I think, grandfather had become a bit disenchanted with the new management of the station, and he leased a little farm, and so we moved there. It was a small farm. It was a dairy, and so we had to milk cows, and I had to milk cows as well. There was no school, however, that I was able to go to, so me and a couple of other young ones in the extended family who were all living together, we had to have correspondence, which was called correspondence, or distance learning as it's called today. And our tutor was my aunt, and she was just the most beautiful lady.
What was her name?
Zilla. And we were supposed to be doing distance education, but I don't know that we were too strict on that, so I always laugh about the fact that a lot of our time was spent running down the pumpkin patch or in the creek catching yabbies. We learnt a little bit about hunting and how to find honey, a goanna, witchetty grubs, and I've eaten quite a bit of wild food.
Have you? What have you eaten?
Yeah, witchetty grubs, goanna, kangaroo, porcupine.
Do you have a favourite?
I like porcupine.
You like porcupine?
But I wouldn't touch them now, of course, any native species.
Who taught you these things?
Oh, well, I didn't go hunting on my own because I was a child then. Probably, I don't know, an uncle, maybe grandmother would have known a bit. So the country life, was quite idyllic, you could say, and fairly happy. Of course, comparing conditions though with today, it was a real struggle financially, because Grandpa didn't earn a lot of money, and it was sometimes finding dinner was pretty hard, but we got through. And certainly living on the farm, we had fowls and we had milk, and we grew vegetables. So on all that, we managed to survive. But after 2 years on the farm, he moved us closer to a little house a couple of miles outside the town of Gymna. And from there, we went to the Gymna State School. Now, Grandma loved fishing, and there's a photo of her down at the creek with her fishing line. And this was when we were in Gymna on the little house outside of town. And so there's Grandma there. Now, there's me there.
That's you?
As a child, yes. And this is my Aunt Zilla there. I can't even make these out with my glasses. Oh, and here's Aunt Zilla's child there, Peter. So she's got those two.
How old was that photo?
Well, I would have been about 9 or 10 there.
Wow.
So 43, 42. So how many years is that? 60, 80 years?
Wow, that's in good nick for 80 years.
I was always top of the class, actually. And one day, we were doing an arithmetic assignment.
That's maths, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And the teacher just say, well, Betty Anderson, what did you get, So I gave him an answer. And then he asked another little lass in my class, and she gave a different answer. So he didn't bother to check it, the sum.
Uh-huh.
And so he said to me, well, Betty Anderson, just because you're always top of the class doesn't mean to say you're always right.
Right.
So I was a bit affronted by that, of course, and I went home with the math question and discussed it with my aunt, and we both got the same answer. So the next day I went up to see him, and I said, "Sir, I still get the same answer. And he just shrugged.
That's very brave and confident, and to go and such a... How old were you?
For a 10-year-old, I guess.
You're 10 years old?
I was about 10.
Do you remember what the sum was?
No. I should mention that, I was 6 when war broke out. We were living in the country, so we were quite safe. There were a lot of army camps around us, and I suppose as children you don't think too much about it. But there was a ration, of course, system brought in then of food and clothing, and everybody, this applied throughout the country, not only the country but throughout the world, the Western world. But it didn't affect us too much. So I was 12 when war, when peace was declared.
That's a long time to live through
5
with
years.
rations and things.
Yes. And I think ration continued for a while as well. It didn't really affect us so much because we didn't have much money to buy stuff anyway. So a couple of years in the Gymna school, and then grandfather was working on cattle properties around there then, and but then he got a job in a little place called Gymna. Mm-hmm. So he went into a timber mill job. They had cottages for the mill workers, so we had a little cottage into which we moved. And so I've spent the last probably 3 years of my primary education at the Gymna State School. Now this is the little cottage in Gymna that we had at the back. It was a tiny little place.
Wow, how special you have all these.
Hmm?
How special you have all these photos.
How special, yes. As far as I can remember, there was just one state high school in the state, and that was in Brisbane.
There was only one?
One.
Really?
And the others were private schools
I didn't
run
know
by
that.
the churches. Yes.
Wow.
So you had to go to a boarding school. And of course, only those with means could do that.
Right.
A lot of kids, of course, couldn't afford that. Families couldn't. And my family couldn't.
So when did you finish school? How old were you when you
Yes,
finished school?
I was probably 14 and a half, if not 15. But I was very determined to get an education. And I had this opportunity to come to Brisbane. A Brisbane manager within this sawmill came up one day and asked the local manager if there was a young girl available that might like to come to live with his family and be a mother's help. So I saw this as me and my grandma, of course, saw this as an opportunity to come to the city where I could go to night school.
Right.
And I had this accommodation and a little job to support myself. So that's how I started there. I think I was with them for about a year, that's right. The Rodwell family it was. And Viva and Jeff Rodwell were their names. And then he said one day, oh look, the company is interested, they need more comptometrists.
Need more what?
Comptometrists.
What's that?
Well, they operate adding machines.
Right. Oh, so is that what you did?
I learnt, yes. This company sent me to, morning school for 3 months to learn this machine. And, it divides and multiplies as well.
It's like a calculator.
Yeah, it's a calculator, in other words, exactly.
How big was it?
About that big.
It was like a giant calculator.
You're doing this on keys.
Right.
And so I learnt this machine and got a job in the Brisbane office with this timber company.
And you were how old at this?
Oh, probably 16 by then, I suppose.
You were 16?
I suppose so, yes. So here's Grandma again. I took her up to Lone Pine once. I must have been in Brisbane then, and she was visiting, obviously. And that's just her looking out the car. So where are we at? We're in this new chapter of me in the city.
Yeah.
The war's over.
And you just got a job at the big computer, the big calculator.
The calculator, the comptometer. There was concern arising again with the conditions of Indigenous people. Viva in particular became interested in the conditions for Indigenous, and of course she had me in the family. She was like a foster mother to me by this time, by the way. So she was making contact with Indigenous people, but also she had these young children, and she had a Catholic background. I guess she had a bit of a problem with Catholicism, and she was looking for ways, what's a good way to raise my children? And so she was looking, just searching, I think, and she met the Baha'is. She met the Baha'is in Brisbane. Viva and Jeff became interested in these groups and what they were doing. And I, in turn, of course, also became interested because of this interest I had in social change and race relations. It just made a lot of sense to me that this was the way forward. So 6 months after the Rodwells became Baha'is, I became a Baha'i as well.
And how old were you?
I would have been 18.
18?
I was the only youth in Queensland, I think.
The only youth, Baha'i youth
Yeah, well,
in
there were
Queensland.
not. The faith was. There weren't many towns where the faith that had been open to the faith at that stage. In fact, I'm trying to remember if there were any other towns outside Brisbane. I kind of feel that Lismore over the border was the closest. So we started to work as Baha'is. There was a call for pioneers that There was always calls for pioneers.
What does it mean to pioneer? What do you mean by pioneering?
Pioneering means going and opening up a new centre, or country. And a lot of the Australian Baha'is went to the Pacific. So at this age, I decided to go to Ballarat. There was a lady there, Violet Hernker was her name. She was a matron at the hospital and a very dedicated Baha'i. So I went down there to join her. She was a lot older than me, though. I went down there in the middle of winter. So that was all very right. I got a job and I was just, with Vi and feeling very incompetent, though. She was just so... Well, I was still very young. I was still uneducated. I didn't know a lot about the faith. I knew in my heart what it was all about. But trying to teach other people is a different...
Teach other people about the faith.
That's right. And but anyway, I was doing my best. I was always aware I needed a lot more to learn because I hadn't read the literature. The Baha'i literature. It's a high standard. The concepts are, very elevated. They're not. You really need to be pretty well educated to understand that sort of literature, which I didn't have as a kid that had only been in primary school. A couple of wee Baha'is decided to do a road trip, and we went out to Dalby. We visited, this is my Aunt Zilla. And
that's
her
Aunt
husband.
Zilla.
That's Aunt Zilla, and that's her husband George, Uncle George. And these are Baha'is from Brisbane.
So you came back to Brisbane?
I got my old job back, actually, with this sawmill, and I stayed in Brisbane. By this time, I'd done studies to get a university matriculation, and in arts. But then at this age, then I decided I should try pioneering again, because they were needing pioneers in Newcastle. So I go down there. There were other Baha'is there, so it was much easier. I enrolled at university there, but it was in arts, and that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I pulled out of that. And the aim then was to save money and go to England to the World Conference in 1963.
The World Conference?
The first World Conference.
A Baha'i World Conference?
Yes.
What would happen at that conference?
Well, that's when the Universal House of Justice was elected. I need to find my handkerchief. I get a bit emotional when I'm talking about some of these things. Yes, I arrived in London in February, so I got a job. I went by boat to London.
You sailed over to London?
Yeah, it was a 6-week journey. And I made a lot of friends on the boat because most of them were Australian, and I was able to attend the conference. So with that conference, there were certain things that stuck out in my memory, and one of them was the first members of the House coming out. So humble, heads bowed, total silence. So that was, I'm glad that's the most important memory I have. I remember Ruhia Khanum. She was a very powerful speaker. And I don't remember what she said, but she had some gestures that we always remember. It was tremendous seeing old friends and obviously relatives just gathering together again. It would have been wonderful for all of those people. So I have very vivid memories of this occasion before we all went in. And I always say, can you picture 5,000 people trying to move into Albert Hall together? 5,000 all at once. Would have been a challenge for the people at the door. I was able to see Shoghi Effendi's grave, so that was, a privilege too.
How old were you again during this conference?
Well, 1963, going on 30.
And how long did you stay in London?
I left there in June. My grandmother wanted her little girl back home. I didn't want to come back to Australia. I'd sort of envisaged staying in London, England, and going further afield. But I couldn't disappoint my grandmother, make her sad. I think I've showed you this. I did this little album when I went to serve at the National Office one year.
Right.
And I wanted, to have some photos with me down there. So I just took these out and had them with me. But these are the Hindsons, and some of them are in the USA. So I have considered my life very rich, as I say, of learning about the faith early, of having lived with this the Rodwell family, who were great role models for me, and then having meeting people from all over the world, and then meeting Baha'is from all over the world. Mm-hmm. Then having this opportunity to further my studies, I was able to get a position in the Queensland government, which was a challenge, and that's a big story in itself. The department was considered very paternalistic. As white settlement spread, the life of the Indigenous people was diminished. The lands were taken over, the cattle, the stock polluted the waterholes, the rivers. It even impacted on the wildlife, which the Indigenous had to rely on, and also the horrible thing, the truth needs to be told for sure. The white settlers, they just shot Aborigines. If they were in the way, or if they'd speared a horse or a cow, they would. That's what happened. And the thing was that they could do this without impunity. They were not, questioned. So, of course, Indigenous people were able to, they fought back as well as they could, but a spear and a gun are two different things. As the population was diminishing and also unable to live off the land as they did, the government brought them all into these communities. They were called missions.
Do you see your culture reflected in the faith?
Yes, I do, certain aspects. I think in Indigenous society, from what I understand of it, it was people worked within the groups, within the families and within the groups. Mm-hmm. So there would have been consultation, I would think, within the family, and that goes out to the wider group. My understanding is that in traditional times, families operated to some extent as a family. We weren't tribes, apparently, we were more family groups. A number of family groups have formed a bigger group, but in certain respects they were living independently. They had their own little quarters, as it were, but they'd move as a bigger group. And they, would have been required to consult on when it was necessary to move, most likely for getting food, I think, well, in the Baha'i faith, of course, where everything starts within the family, so consultation within the family is very important, isn't it? If you don't practice in the family, you're going to have difficulty practicing it in the wider community. So the idea of consultation, I think, is something that they have in common. From my experience, when I was young, respect for older people was very important. I think in the faith, respect for everybody is important, as opposed to outside the faith. What I can see anyway, young people really, they're not at all shy or backward in challenging their parents. If they want to do something, I think they do it. Who's to say that sometimes the young ones may be wiser too, and do make the better decisions for themselves. However, I think perhaps it's more widespread that young people today in modern society, they are much more independent and feel they have the right to speak out and challenge their parents. There's one of my husband. That's me, of course. My mother-in-law and I in California.
California.
My husband went to Berkeley for a year in Berkeley Uni.
Yeah.
Do some studies. So I took leave and went with him and the two boys. And my in-laws came and visited us when we were there. So my mother-in-law and I clowning around. I was brought up really outside a traditional Indigenous culture. I was really brought up, my grandparents, they were pretty well westernised really, and so that's how I see myself. But my grandmother did say to me, always be proud you're an Aboriginal, Elizabeth. So, and I probably subconsciously remembered that. But I have no problem because I had a wonderful Aboriginal family and upbringing that I'm proud of that. I couldn't have found a better woman to raise me than my grandmother and my grandfather. So, what people think of me, it wouldn't have worried me at all. But I was very open. I'd always tell them what I was. And a lot of them didn't believe me half the time because they also had images of, what an Indigenous person was, which was probably a bit, derogatory or less than human sometimes. I think today we're struggling with value systems from one extreme to the other, and it's some of the values we would probably agree are not conducive to health and stability and respect and love. It's toxic, really. Some of it is. So on the other hand, we have to think about what are the values that should be practiced that ensure that families and society as a whole achieves stability and equality. Every individual, we all are very different, and we should not try to evaluate differences, but try to appreciate what they are and how each individual's contribution, whatever they're skilled at, whatever they can do, there should be a way for everyone to be able to express the best of themselves. And I think only then can we have, people are going to be happy and satisfied and feeling fulfilled. I think so very important, is looking at the individuals today and not trying to put us all in one mould, but appreciating our diversity.
Do you have any words of advice for the youth of today, like my age, from your life that you've learned?
Believe in yourself. Try to explore Well, try to identify, I suppose, what you think is best within you, that you've got to offer the community, but also that would be fulfilling for yourself and give you a sense of achievement, and accept who you are, recognise your potential, but recognise what may be something you can never do, you know. But don't worry about that. Put that to the side and go for what you can do. Have confidence.